All right, well, let's get started, and then I'll work with her to get joined. But thank you, everyone, for joining us. I want to introduce myself really quick. My name is Jillian Rook. I'm the Executive Director of Child USA. And we, about 4 years ago, started the Game Over Commission to examine the case of the Larry Nassar abuse, to understand how all of these institutions failed to protect these young girls. We assembled experts from around the country in child welfare to really examine this issue from that angle. And they're here today to talk about the final report we put out and the solutions that they've really highlighted to what we can do to fix this problem moving forward. So we are very excited to have them. We've gotten lots of questions about this report, so please put your questions in the chat if you have them for the commissioners, and we'll make sure to get to them. So let me hand it off and introduce our moderator, our CEO and founder of Child USA, Professor Marci Hamilton. She was also the chair of the commission of which was the brainchild of the chairman of our board, James Marsh, who is also on this panel today. So I'll hand it over to Marci to introduce everyone and get everything kicked off.
Great, thanks, Jill. So I want to thank everybody who's joining us today. And the topic is, how do we stop or at least prevent sex abuse in sports? We keep having one story after another, from Sandusky to Nassar to the latest, in which we've learned that one of the players on the Penn State team was a rapist. So this is a culture that we can only change with input from across the culture. And we are blessed with the fact that we had a variety of types of experts. They agreed to be on the commission, and today they're going to talk about, from their perspective as their area of expertise, the recommendations and explaining those recommendations. But the larger purpose of today's webinar is to explain what's the future. We no longer can simply rely on stories. The media got us all interested, but we now have to take proactive action. So let me start by saying that every commissioner on the Game Over Commission has been an incredible asset. They're all listed in the report and the first appendix. But we're focusing today in the report on pages 50 and 51. Those are the shorthand lists of recommendations. And we're honored today to have back with us Dr. Scribano, who is the section chief for Safe Place, the Center for Child Protection and Health at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He's also a professor of clinical pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. And he will be talking about one of the issues that has not really gotten a lot of attention, but is a serious problem. And that is, what do we do about medical boards and licensing, thinking about Nassar having his license right up to the end? So let me turn it over to Dr. Scribano, and thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Marci, and welcome everyone who's given us your hour for a very important topic. As Marci said, we've spent a fair amount of time together learning and growing and hoping to have some change and reform for the protection of children. I come at this from the standpoint as a child abuse pediatrician, and I think that there in the report, you will see, I'll say, two main areas. One, as was mentioned, is really the issues of reform in terms of our medical licensing oversight. But before I even mention that area, I want to also talk about the issue of a child advocacy center and the opportunity that investigators have to utilize multidisciplinary experts, including physicians, during their investigations. And in fact, one of the failures that we identified was related to the FBI's lack of the use of this very well-established, validated system. It's an accredited process for child advocacy centers to create a child-friendly environment for the investigation of suspected child sexual abuse and other forms of maltreatment. And that was not used. And that is an opportunity as we think about, even with moving forward, how to inform and ensure that our investigators are aware of that resource. There's an MOU with the National Children's Alliance, which accredits all of the child advocacy centers and the FBI. And so there's opportunities really to strengthen that linkage. I also want to mention just the issues of medical oversight and licensure in particular. And what we identified were a couple of things. One is that the Federation of State Medical Boards, which is our state licensing board for each state, has to have, I would say, a more robust process of definition of what constitutes sexual misconduct, and the way in which states are defining this leaves open gaps that may have influence in not having reports completed or not having investigations and even penalties. And so that is a piece and an area that we can talk about further, having the clear terminology as we distinguish what is contact offenses or sexual abuse versus sexual impropriety, harassment, things like that may have a different approach in terms of the penalties. Expanding the acts that require mandatory discipline. There's a lot of variability within states in terms of how that's approached. The issue of transparency. Medical boards have a very closed and, for good reason, confidentiality, but at the expense of victims, it's not acceptable. And there are gaps and ways in which the increased transparency is necessary to increase public confidence and have a process of accountability. And then having broader requirements of reporting misconduct to medical boards. And this includes hospitals. And so we talk mostly in the report about, in fact, almost exclusively about medical boards, but there's a movement and an effort that also needs to go to accreditation of hospitals and how hospitals may be looking at this and having that information when they decide about hires. Certainly physicians who've been terminated on grounds that are related to sexual misconduct, these kinds of things need to be more out there so that physicians can't go from one institution to the other or one state to the other without having some social awareness, societal awareness that they exist, given the risks that we know from Nassar and certainly from others. There are states that have more robust policies than others. And I think that there are exemplars in state laws that we can look at and start to promote and advocate for in other state mandates. So I'll stop there. I think it's about 5 minutes. I wanted to make sure that I didn't go over. So thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Essentially what you heard from Phil is what we experienced for the 3.5 years we were doing this investigation. I mean, we were literally drinking out of a fire hose. There were so many failures in so many institutions. And of course, one of them was the medical system itself. So there's a tremendous amount to be done there. So I'd like to turn it over now to Elysse Stolpe. She is an assistant Commonwealth attorney for the city of Waynesboro, Virginia, AKA a prosecutor for child sex abuse cases. And she's a lecturer at the University of Virginia School of Law. She's going to talk about the failures and the solutions for the fact that the FBI all the way down let these victims down. So Elysse.
Thank you, Marci. As Marci said, I am very focused on, well, I'm a prosecutor, but I'm very focused on the issue of combating child abuse, particularly child sex abuse in Virginia state courts. But as part of my everyday life, I'm constantly working with other players in the criminal justice system. And so I have seen firsthand the importance of being able to leverage those relationships with other professionals such as doctors, such as Dr. Scribano described, that those types of relationships are extraordinarily important for addressing such a multifaceted issue as child abuse. And we saw that what happens when you don't use those methods, those tried and true methods, firsthand when we looked at the Nassar case and the failings of the FBI in particular. So when I analyzed the issue of the FBI's failures and opportunities for improvement, I looked at 3 distinct buckets of information. And there was some overlap with some of the other sections in the report, because a lot of what we do with the criminal justice system in investigating these types of cases is informed by the science and the practical knowledge that we have from other disciplines, such as the fields of psychology and medicine. So there is a bit of overlap there. The first bucket of information that I looked at was the issues with the interviews. So when this issue first came to light with Nassar, it was in July of 2015, and the notification was done by the USA Gymnastics to the FBI, and immediately the ball was dropped because there wasn't prompt attention paid to interviewing the victims that had come forward in the course of the USA Gymnastics investigation. The second bucket of information that I looked at was the failure to utilize a multidisciplinary perspective or multidisciplinary task force to investigate these crimes, which was particularly important because it intersected with the field of medicine. And obviously we can't expect our law enforcement officers to be subject matter experts in everything that may touch the criminal justice system, since it's just so varied and changing so rapidly. That really underscores the importance of establishing these professional working relationships so that we can leverage other experts in fields that may intersect with the criminal justice system. And third, the last place that I looked at as a failure and an opportunity was the failure to ensure that actual appropriate authorities were notified and involved in the investigation. Early on would have been ideal. Any time actually would have been better than what happened in this case. By sitting on the report, the FBI allowed at least 70 additional athletes to be harmed after Nassar's acts were first reported, and that we don't often get that kind of hard number, that data point showing just how impactful that lack of action is. But in this case, it was very stark just because of the high numbers of victims involved. So when I go back and look at the first opportunity for improvement, we previously have noted that there was an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, which is a common practice for leveraging these interdisciplinary relationships in order to assure that information is properly transmitted in all directions, so everyone's on the same playing field. So from the very beginning, this was a complex and multi-jurisdictional case, just by the very nature of the USA Gymnastics structure, going across state lines, going overseas. There was the potential for these actions to have crossed many, many different jurisdictional boundaries. One of the other things that we've learned, though, is that it's not good for a child to have interviews, multiple interviews done. That not just from a legal perspective, we don't want to create potentially conflicting information from inadvertent small details, but we also don't want to re-traumatize the child by having multiple interviews and multiple interactions or more interactions than are necessary. So the interviews themselves, when they were conducted, if they were conducted, were not in a child-friendly and trauma-informed manner. And going forward, the way to change that is to not be having field agents conducting interviews with victims in over phone, or really even in person. If especially if it is a child or adolescent victim, it's very important that you have people who are trained to ask interview questions in a way that's not only going to get to the heart of the matter, but also is going to be in a gentle and legally defensible way, meaning asking open-ended questions, ensuring that proper terminology is used and that the child feels comfortable disclosing. Doing that over the phone with a child in her bedroom, as Michaela Maroney described in her testimony, was the exact opposite of what that child-friendly interview process looks like. So you want to ensure that we want to ensure there's prompt access to an appropriate interviewer. And that can be done through actually the format that was set out in the Memorandum of Understanding in 2015, coincidentally before the allegations even came to light in summer of 2015. They obviously didn't follow those recommendations in the MOU, which outlined essentially that there's going to be a network of child advocacy centers across the country who could perform these interviews at a minute's notice, so that there would be quick geographic access to a facility that's set up in an interview room with a recording device, so that you don't have to re-interview the child. That interview video can be shared with the different members of the multidisciplinary team. If you discover that a crime actually occurred in a different jurisdiction, that new jurisdiction doesn't have to re-interview the child. They can just take that DVD of the interview and be able to use that to start their investigation. So it's a much more efficient and child-friendly way of conducting these types of sensitive investigations. Now, you may be thinking, well, that interview or that MOU came out in 2015, and surely they must have put some rules into place or guidance into place as to how to use that. But as recently as 2020, actually, there have been athletes involved in my sport, the equestrian sport, who have been interviewed by FBI agents that in ways that are in no way, shape, or form have any relation whatsoever to the guidance set forth in the MOU. So children are still being interviewed over the phone with non-child friendly practices. So you want to be able to make sure either that there is a facility for a trained investigator or a trained interviewer from the FBI, a CAFI, a certified child and adolescent forensic interviewer, or a local CAC, Children's Advocacy Center interviewer. The second piece of sort of objective that we would be looking to make recommendations for improvement would be in the related field of using a multidisciplinary perspective. In this case, Dr. Nasser was able to sort of snow investigators very easily by using medical jargon and basically using his authority as a medical figure with his fancy websites and titles and videos and PowerPoints to really make the agents call into question this kind of inkling that there may be something hinky about what he's doing, but we're not really sure because he has a lot of fancy words. And the way to mitigate the risk of that compromising an investigation in the future would be to make sure we're approaching these investigations from a multidisciplinary perspective. So using physicians, forensic nurses, child mental health care providers, any opportunity to have additional education for us as law enforcement officers, prosecutors, or police officers, FBI agents, to learn about the inner workings of whatever the subject is related to that child abuse investigation. So this would have looked something like perhaps having either having the FBI agents coordinate with the local child advocacy center multidisciplinary task force. I sit on an MDT here in my area of Virginia, and we have multiple law enforcement agencies from our area actually come together once a month and discuss cases. And that MDT also involves and incorporates people who perform sex offender treatment sort of modalities when looking at offenders, potential child offenders, and people who offend against children. So we have that perspective, you have the medical perspective, and being able to have that wraparound expertise, make sure information isn't falling through the cracks on any of these cases. The other option would potentially be to use the Violent Crimes Against Children unit of the FBI, which is based in Washington, D.C., as to create a multidisciplinary task force with agents that are handling these types of cases to make sure all the cases are adequately reviewed. And that actually leads me to my next point, which is the failure to notify appropriate authorities and make sure all potential jurisdictions were involved and aware of the Nassar allegations. This case, as I said, crossed many different geographic boundaries and the state versus federal boundary as well. And there seemed to be a lot of sort of attempt to maintain ownership of the case by the FBI instead of involving state and local authorities, which are actually more likely to be the people with the statutes and the law that can address these types of cases. The FBI their statutes are set up more for actual sex trafficking, crossing interstate lines, sex tourism, things that weren't exactly what was going on here. And so actually the state authorities were more appropriate for actually being able to prosecute Nassar, but they weren't notified, they weren't involved. And so what we would envision is using the Violent Crimes Against Children unit to create a center point for these investigations to ensure that the appropriate authorities have been notified, and that also there's communication across those boundaries about the cases, the status, who has been notified, what evidence has gone where. And also that's going to mitigate the potential for there to be one point of failure. There were lots of failures in this case, but a lot of them can be attributed to a single FBI agent. And if we can avoid having a single person sort of carrying the weight of these cases, that is going to help ensure that children aren't falling through the cracks, and that the appropriate forensic interviewers are involved, the appropriate state authorities are involved. And that's not saying, that there has to be a parallel investigation, as in the state needs to run its own investigation versus the FBI, but that information is shared across those two investigations. Maybe you just have to do one interview, but if you have it on a DVD, like you should, if you did it at a CAC, you're going to be able to share that interview back and forth across jurisdictions and not re-traumatize a child. So those are just a few of the areas that we could potentially see change made to create a more effective investigatory structure within the FBI and also jurisdictions across the country to make sure kids aren't falling through the cracks.
Thank you so much, Elysse. I mean, what we've heard so far is you've got a doctor telling you there aren't enough people in the system, either the medical boards or the prosecutors, who are listening to the doctor's expertise. And you've got a prosecutor saying, we need to listen to more of that. And so there is this interdisciplinary need in terms of approaching child sex abuse, instead of just the focus on, certainly it's not enough to focus on the perpetrator. We focused on the institutions. And the answer to widespread sexual abuse by a perpetrator at any university, in sport, in a kids' soccer league, is what we're aiming for here is a cultural change. It's really not just any one solution. It's going to take all of these solutions. And also for the public to understand what it is that it's going to take. So let me now hand this over to Joyanna Silberg. She is a PhD. She's also the owner of Childhood Recovery Resources. She's a president of the Leadership Council on Child Abuse and Interpersonal Violence. She's going to talk today about one of the original elements of our report, which are the surveys and what we learned through social science about this particular case. Joyanna?
Thank you so very much, Marci. Everyone has been talking about our children falling through the cracks and what some of those cracks might be. And the ones that we uncovered through our social science research were really mind-blowing, overwhelming, and terrifying to think that these children are in a culture in which their basic needs are basically being ignored. What we found is that these children become accommodated to a culture in which they subsume their own needs, their own physical needs, their own emotional needs, and they become extremely authority conscious. For example, in our elite athlete survey, 96% of the young people, athletes who are elite athletes, report that the major decisions of their lives were done by their coaches, including how to spend their free time and what to eat. Also concerning is that 85% reported to us that they hid their medical injuries, and so they were forced to practice or to compete while they were injured. Now, what does this have to do with abuse? This has everything to do with abuse, because when a child is trained to ignore their body's own signals, when they're trained to the fact that it doesn't really matter what they feel or what they think, they just have to do what an authority says, they are very, very confused about the ownership of their own body and what's right and what boundaries are. We looked specifically at some of the Nassar victims themselves. We had a survey which we sent to them. And one thing that pretty much was astounding was that 100% of them said they had no idea what to do to report abuse. A very large percentage, 96%, said they didn't even know what sexual assault was. And none of them knew what was supposed to happen or what the details of an investigation were supposed to be. So we have a big, giant hole. And when Marci talks about a cultural change, this is really where we need to see a very important cultural change, where we're really changing the power dynamics between the athletes and their coaches, where the athletes themselves are not just pawns and victims of an authoritarian structure that tells them that they can ignore their own needs, because that is the kind of culture which sets them up to be victims. Another really important aspect of the work that was done was Child USA contributed through the work of Stephanie Dallum, what perfectly good child sexual abuse policies should be. What is the gold standard? And Dr. Dallum was able to identify 13 key pieces of policy that every good organization, youth group ought to have. And we found none of them had them all. But just to give you an example, there's basically two kinds of policies: prevention policies and then reporting policies. Prevention policies would include things like education for the children, the coaches, the volunteers, the parents, the staff. It would include rules of conduct. Where are people allowed to touch each other? What about rules about transportation? What about rules about sleeping accommodations when you go on trips? We also felt that there was a need for special kinds of teaching for the elite athletes who are so vulnerable to this power dynamic. And then in terms of reporting, we need mandatory reporting. We need it to go to the exact authorities that are required in the jurisdiction. And then we need cooperation with the investigation. And we need the kids and the athletes to be protected during the course of that investigation. We have to have policies that ensure their protection. And finally, we have to have constant feedback to continue to improve policies. And that's really one of the things that our commission is looking at. How did such major failure happen? Well, let's go back and review it, and let's see how we can improve policy. And all organizations should have that drive to improve policies as time goes on. So that's what I wanted to contribute. And I thank everyone for paying attention to this extraordinarily important information.
Thank you, Joy. That was a perfect segue accidentally into your talk about cultural change. That's what we need from the ground up, and the relationships between the youth athletes and their coaches and the system and their parents. All of those we examined, and if you're interested, these policies are, these surveys are talked about in the commission report. And we also have a series of ongoing publications. There will be 3 publications within the next 6 months on the elite athlete study and what we need to do about these athletes being treated as essentially second-class citizens. So let me hand it over now to James Marsh. Yes, this was his brainchild. He was the one that said, let's just do a commission on these issues, because I was very worried about, are we all just going to forget the Larry Nassar scandal? And are we going to go on and not learn from it? And so I was delighted when he recommended it. It was a very heavy lift for everybody. And Jillian Ruck, our executive director, really moved the train, made it happen. But James was a great participant as well. He is one of the leading child sex abuse attorneys in the country, specializing in child sex exploitation. He's, of course, the chairman of our board, and he's the founder of Children's Law Center. So James is going to speak to us about the things Congress needs to do. James?
Right. Thank you very much, Marci, for that introduction. I'm sort of tasked with the job of saying, like, how do we fix the mess, right? At least from a administrative and legal aspect. And what we found, 2 of the things I'm going to talk about that are mentioned in the recommendations are bankruptcy reform. And you might be asking, well, why bankruptcy? Why is that? How is that part of this problem? And also going to touch briefly on SOL, and they're sort of in some ways conjoined issues. And then there are some recommendations in there for reforming safe sport, having congressional oversight. Those things are pretty self-explanatory. And there's always law reform going on in this area. We've been working hard to expand the rights of children to bring cases in federal court, especially for failure to report. That's one of the areas that we really want to focus on, allowing athletes like in the Olympics to be able to hold the individuals who fail to do anything responsible, which sounds easy, but it can be much more complicated given what we've seen with the FBI, with so many jurisdictions involved. This is truly, at least elite sport is a trans-jurisdictional kind of enterprise. It's not limited to one sport, one gym. You've got people traveling internationally. You've got abuse taking place during meets in different states, and this creates a structural legal complication and barriers to justice for victims and survivors. The thing that I want to talk about specifically, though, is bankruptcy. I'll spend just at least a few minutes on that issue. So why is bankruptcy important? Bankruptcy is important in this area because so many of the institutions involved have gone bankrupt in response to an overwhelming number of claims against them. Certainly the U.S. Not the U.S. Olympic Committee, but the U.S. Gymnastics Board, I can't remember what they're called, went bankrupt. And we've seen this in the Catholic Church, a lot of churches, dioceses, seen this in other large entities. Certainly organizations like Michigan State, you may say University of Michigan now being sued, Ohio State possibly. These institutions are too big to fail. But when you get with the governing bodies, these are not necessarily asset-rich organizations. They don't own property. They don't own land by and large. They don't have any hard assets. But what they do have is insurance, and they have coverage for some or all of these claims. And so one of the very typical reactions to a large number of claims, like we've seen in the Olympics, and you've all probably heard the news in the Catholic Church and some of the other entities have gone bankrupt, is to declare bankruptcy. So there are 2 different kinds of bankruptcy. There is a liquidation bankruptcy. I think that's what most people think about when they think about bankruptcy. And then there's also reorganization bankruptcy. And that is to allow an institution or entity to keep doing business, to reconstitute, to be able to carry on their mission while meeting these obligations. Typically, that's in the context of being unable to pay your bills, being unable to have a cash flow problem, lack of donors, some sort of, structural problems with the organization. It's very different when you're dealing with cases involving sex abuse and reorganization, because it's not really that these entities, don't have the wherewithal or ability to keep going. It's that they have so many claims that they could never pay, and they need to unlock the value in their insurance in order to pay these claims. And so these are reorganization bankruptcies. They take place under the bankruptcy code in federal court, and there are some structural problems here. And probably the biggest structural problem, which is very unique to this kind of bankruptcy, is the inability to value the claims of the victims. And the insurance industry relies on this, and the institutions rely on this to really thwart meaningful compensation, or especially meaningfully quick compensation for victims. And what I mean by that is that, if you can't pay your bills, you know what your bills are, right? You've got all of these bills, you've got unsold merchandise, you've got, this and that. So these constitute in bankruptcy, fairly, understandable kind of things. I got $2 million in bills and $1 million in assets and no income. How are we going to work this out? That's a typical bankruptcy. In this case, you have not millions, but hundreds, maybe thousands of claims, and you believe that you don't have the assets to pay for these claims, but you do have insurance. So these institutions have gone bankrupt in that context. And the big missing piece here is the inability of the bankruptcy courts to actually determine the value of those claims in any sort of normative or structural way. So in other words, since most of these claims, there is no federal sex, tort law. So most of these claims, if they were brought outside of bankruptcy, would be brought in state court. Federal court governs the bankruptcy. So the problem is, once you're in bankruptcy, all of these state court claims get frozen. Everything gets put into bankruptcy. And then at the bankruptcy level in the federal court, there's no ability to value these claims through any sort of, normative ways that we do in court. Petition, evidence, experts, damages, outcomes, harms. Those things become a matrix, if you will, in federal bankruptcy court. And there's no real way for individual victims and individual survivors to have their claims valued for true value. They get put into a machine, which at the end of the day spits out a valuation. And so that is very harmful to victims. It takes many, many years. There's, just a huge structural problem in the bankruptcy system that needs to be reformed. That's probably the easiest one to understand. Some of the other ones get progressively more complicated. Like, I don't know if you've been following the Purdue bankruptcy. It's third-party releases, who gets released, what other parties that are not in bankruptcy get releases, and how those parties contribute to the bankruptcy. So that's all too complicated. Well, they say it's too complicated for the purpose of today's call. But that's another part of bankruptcy. It's very controversial right now, and it especially impacts these kinds of cases because there are so many corollary entities. Think of the Boy Scouts. You've got the councils, you've got the sponsoring organizations, you've got tens of thousands of entities that are part of the bankruptcy for the BSA. Same thing in sports. You've got the clubs, you've got the local leagues, you've got, look at where Nassar had access to victims in so many different settings that would be very critical to have a consideration of in bankruptcy. So that's bankruptcy. Perhaps the easier thing is the SOL, and how does that impact bankruptcy? The way that impacts bankruptcy is that individuals who live or are abused in states with windows that Child USA has gone taken a lead role in nationally and internationally in expanding opportunities for victims of historic child sex abuse to bring their cases in court. But that, again, that is a state law issue and a state law problem, and every state has different SOLs, every state has different windows, and individuals maybe many victims and survivors, and we saw this in Nassar, because they were from so many different jurisdictions, they are limited in their ability to achieve justice just across the board because they don't have a cause of action in court. And so SOL reform is very important in the ability to bring individuals and institutions to accountability for victims. A victim in Michigan who has an open window, a victim in New York who has an open window, should be treated the same as a victim, I don't know, New Mexico, where are there no open windows? Florida, Texas, and Pennsylvania. Those victims do not stand on the same foot as all of the other victims because they literally cannot go to court to bring their claims against the perpetrators or the institutions. So along with this that affects their valuations in bankruptcy, right? Marci Hamilton, state of Pennsylvania. Well, you can't bring a lawsuit, so your claim isn't worth very much, Marci. You know, we don't have to pay you anything, even if you could bring it, because you can't, right? Oh, victim in New York, wow, you got a wide open window. You filed your claim on time. Your claim is worth a lot more because you happen to be in the state of New York when the window was open. Or Vermont, you've got no statute of limitation at all. You know, your claims are good until the day that you die. So we need a consistent way of looking at statute of limitations in this country. We're working on the federal level to increase the statutes of limitations for the federal cause of action. Child USA has taken the lead at the state level in expanding windows and statutes of limitation there. But again, individual athletes are going to be impacted depending on where they live. Even if they are an Olympic athlete competing in Japan, competing in China, competing in Europe, you know, they're going to be hamstrung by their state statutes of limitation. So that's why that's so important. So obviously I could go on all day about things we need to do at the federal and state level, bankruptcy reform, SOL reform, and all kinds of other efforts to remove legal barriers to justice for victims and children. So thank you very much for attending this today, and I'll send it back to Marci to let her, perhaps we're gonna have one more speaker and some questions. So thanks again for supporting Child USA.
So thanks so much, James. And, you know, I think one of the issues that has not been noticed in this arena is that there is uneven justice for the victims of the same perpetrator. So Larry Nassar's victims in Michigan had a lot more justice, access to justice than someone in Virginia, than in Texas. So this is a really important part of this because the stories get covered as national stories. But in terms of access to justice, they're not national laws. And so part of the problem here is that we have a federalism system. We have 50 states and a federal government, but
well, and you've got Guam and you've got the territories and you've got, you know, this is a trans-jurisdictional crime. It happens all over. Guam right now, believe it or not, is the big impediment to the Boy Scout settlement. They have 70 claims out of 70,000. So another example of how bankruptcy can become so corrupted. So, you know, Marci's right. I mean, we've got, we're talking about Title IX, we're talking, you know, that would be relevant at Michigan State for these victims, you know, Title IX defaults to the state, you know, whatever, it could be 1 year or two, you know, so you got all of these disparate sort of impediments, and we're really trying to take a systematic look at removing these barriers to justice. So
exactly. So I'm going to focus on the recommendations with respect to athletes generally, with athletic organizations, but I'm going to kick off my comments with a question. So one of the questions from the audience is, what can everyday people do to keep their kids safe in sports and to support the systemic reform? I think that this Game Over Commission report provides two beacons of light. One of them is that it is absolutely clear that athletes have been treated as commodities in the sports business. And it's not just elite sports, it's up and down. They're the commodities for winning. And so one of the most important recommendations we make is that there should be a federal agency, and it would be above the USOPC, and it would be above the NCAA, and it would be above the AAU, where the young kids are in sport, that would set a standard of athletes first. So we need a center in the United States that exists for athlete protection and well-being, not continue to be in this space where the athlete is really, all they have is their own personal capacity to demand that they be treated humanely. Simone Biles, the greatest of all time in gymnastics, on an international stage, said, I'm not going to compete anymore right now, and I have some psychological issues I've got to deal with.
Well, I think more in conjunction with that, Marci, what we really learned, one of the shocking findings of our study was that the athletes are really commodities to the sports system, right? Whether it's the U.S. Olympic Committee, whether it's the governing bodies, whether it's the coaches, the commoditization of these athletes, and you've heard a little bit about that, slowly, being brought to light, but. The reality that the athletes are aware of, and I think Joy can speak to this in terms of her comments, is that if you're not going to do it, there's 10 little girls behind you that will. So perform, do what I want, do what I say, play the game, or there are 10, 20, 50, 100 people to replace you.
Well, and that's why I raised the Simone Biles story. She's the only one that has that kind of power that has been able to say, look, I'm just stepping down right now, and we need to empower the athletes to be able to do that. And a national center for the protection of athletes that treats athletes as first and not as the commodities of the system would move the ball dramatically. But the other beacon of hope is that Child USA was already working on a gold standard, as we call it. And this is the standard that is evidence-based to put into place top to bottom in sport. So if you go to page 81, when you get a chance to go to the report, that is the summary of the gold standard. And so the question was, so what do I do as a parent trying to protect my kids? What you do is you go to the league where your kid's going to play, or you go to the school where the kid's playing in a sport, and you ask them if they have, do you have a code of conduct for your employees? Do your coaches have to read or follow a code of conduct? How do you deal with reporting misconduct? So if you sense that there's someone who's acting inappropriately with children, what do you do about it? Ask them these specific questions. What do you do about training? What do you do about the fact that parents are usually the least informed, right? And so there are frequently sports, especially elite sports, where parents are told, you don't need to be involved, they'll focus more if it's just us. Your kid does not have to be alone with a coach in a closed space. It's just not necessary, and you can push back on it. I think too many parents have been disabled and told to stand aside for the incredible talent and dreams of their children. And we need to change the system so that the standards become uniform. So what does that mean? That means we're talking to professional sports. We think every major sport at the top should be standing up for ending child sex abuse and protecting children. Right now, there's largely silence. We also need to hear from the Olympic system. The Olympic system is not yet close to where it needs to be. Safe Sport is not performing its charge, which is to create a safe environment for children. We need to wake up and figure out how to do it a lot better. This group of experts has a lot to say about that. We need to worry about the gyms, the leagues. One of the things parents need to know is, where is there a lot of abuse? Like where should I be more concerned than others? Number one, it happens in every sport. Children are radically vulnerable in every situation they're put into. If you get a coach that takes your child alone in a car, you may have reason to be concerned. But let me just close for this question with, how do we make these systems change? We have to have parents who are demanding safety for their children and who aren't going to put up with being told, we'll stand over there, pay a lot of money, and we'll deliver your child back to you, number one. But number two, we need the media to start paying attention to these issues as children's civil rights. This is about treating children as humans and not as the sub-equivalents of adults. The huge problem here is we prefer and protect adults every day of our lives. And when we do that, we leave children's needs to the side too often. And that this report has basically said, look, here's how it's happening in elite athletes. You love your Olympic athletes, you better change the system. So Joyanna, did you want to add anything to that? I've got some more questions, but.
Well, that one is such a key one. And I just want to compliment that parent for asking, because that's the first step. The first step is asking, what can you do? And the other thing I would just add to your fantastic answer is, since we don't have the full education that we need for these athletes, the parents have to be the first step in that education. Educate your child about good touch and bad touch. Educate your child about coming to you if anything makes them feel uncomfortable. Educate your child about their body being theirs and what the boundaries of their bodies are. There are all kinds of curriculums available online. Look at the Darkness to Light website. Find information until we got it in every gym, everywhere. Parents, step up to the plate. And thanks for asking that great question.
So Phil, we have a question for you. Who has the power to reform the medical boards?
Oh, boy. It's certainly not the physicians, I'll just say. The reform of the medical boards really needs to have, I think it's a corollary to that prior question. We in healthcare have been working through some very painful lessons about transparency as it relates to safety and quality in the healthcare system. And in the last 20 years, there's been remarkable progress that's been made that's really improved the way in which we address medical errors, the ways in which we think about and have strategies around healthcare delivery. And I think in a similar way, we have to really think about that in the context of our oversight boards, our medical boards, in terms of how they view themselves. What is the priority? And in healthcare and the whole safety and quality movement, recognized that we were not doing our best. So that's a starting point. We know that there are gaps, and an honest appraisal should prompt organizations, and in this sense, in this case, the medical boards, to look at themselves and look at ourselves as a system that warrants tightening up some of those gaps. There are recommendations that I'll just say the lowest common denominator, having background checks for licensure and renewal. We've got 14 or so states that still do not have statutes in their states to require that. That is a kind of an unfortunate reality that could easily be tightened up. But again, you've got to have states and the federation to sort of lay down the land and the rules for all states to manage their licensing. So that's one aspect.
So we've got a related case, and I'll say something quick, and then I'm going to pop it back to you. There are a lot of cases right now where doctors are perpetrators. Why is that, and how can we stop it? What I've learned looking at all these cases around the country is that there is no one like a doctor to get access to thousands of children. You have someone in their profession who has permission to have children with their clothes off in a closed room, and you can get, what, 20 patients a day, 100 patients a week, thousands. And so we're just now seeing it because it's simply another icon has fallen. It's also partly because in Delaware, we learned about Dr. Earl Bradley in 2008, who had over 1,000 victims come forward, a pediatrician, well-known and highly trusted. So Phil, what are your thoughts on why we're seeing more doctors? Then I asked Elysse and Joy and James the same question.
Well, I want to just qualify that. We're not seeing a lot of doctors. We are seeing and we are having exposure of pedophiles within healthcare.
Right.
So that is a true statement, but I don't want to throw the entire profession in the mix of thinking about that, because there are lots and lots of efforts that are being made both at the state and the statutory level, as well as Joint Commission accreditation and how hospitals are approaching these issues. So that's the one point I wanted to make. And I think that as was mentioned, the parent becomes the greatest educator for their child. They become the greatest advocate. In healthcare, we talk a lot about chaperones and the importance of having chaperones present during sensitive examinations. At the institution I work at here at Children's Hospital, that is promoted, and we discuss that with our patients, and we discuss that with the providers to ensure that they are offering and making sure that families and patients feel comfortable with a delicate situation in terms of a sensitive exam. So that's an empowering action that a parent can take, of insisting that there be a chaperone for that examination, not being told that you need to leave for the examination. There are autonomous decisions that we give adolescents in that awkward time in life to give them the power and choice of who is in the room for that examination. But even if they say, no, I don't want my mom or dad in the exam room, they should insist on a chaperone, on a separate person. I think
I'm going to interrupt, Phil. I don't think we should put it on the victims to insist for the safety. I think the institutions need to implement these kinds of controls to ensure patient safety. And there's a lot of kids that don't have parents. There's a lot of kids that don't have adults involved in their life. And so I'm going to flip it on you and say, I don't even know what a chaperone is as a kid. How can I even spell the word? It's really up to the institutions. And we see this across the board. This is not just a medical problem. I mean, the coaches don't even have governing boards, right? I mean, they don't even have anyone that licenses them. We talked about this during the work of the committee, like, well, who can become a coach? Anyone can walk in the door and become a coach. And what we see here, as it boils down, we see this so much in sex abuse, is a power imbalance. And whether it's a lawyer, a doctor, a coach, a teacher, law enforcement, there's a lot of sex abusers in law enforcement across the board. God knows I love the cops, but they look at the child pornography reports. Every other one of them is someone in law enforcement.
Yeah, let me just qualify. So I live in Philadelphia, not Utopia. So what the question was what can parents do? And I want to make sure that when we talk about this, you're absolutely right. We should never put the responsibility on victims to protect themselves. That goes without saying. But in reality, we all need to protect and have that situational awareness. And there are opportunities, even though hospitals and systems have that available, to the extent that that's made known is fairly variable. So
I'm going to cut in here, but everybody's now gotten the flavor of our commission meetings that would go on for hours with many smart people in a room. As you can imagine, the fact these people did this pro bono says a lot about their character, and we're grateful, but we're really at the end of this time. So I wanted 2 questions. Is there a published framework we can deploy that will standardize our process to your new recommendations? Yes. Go to Appendix H. It's the gold standard, but I want you to understand this is a summary of the gold standard. If your organization, your sports organization, your children's organization wants to learn more about the details, please contact us. at info@childusa.org. And then finally, what are the next steps? Well, the next steps are twofold. First, we are instituting the Game Over Commission Phase 2, in which we are going to put the spotlight on families, the AAU, and the NCAA. I can tell you that both the AAU and the NCAA, unfortunately, have pretended as though these aren't their problems, right? And bad news for them, just like bad news for USOPC, it's their problem. And so we'll be focusing on that. And the other thing that we're focusing on is getting all of the recommendations up and running that are on pages 50 and 51 in the report. We are really serious. This was not just an idle exercise by a bunch of really smart people about an interesting case. This is intended to change things. And so we will be pursuing each of these over time, and we will be working with our commissioners to do that. So let's close out now. I'd like each of you to say just, a couple of words to say to our audience as we close, and both the audience here and the ones who watch in the future. My question for you is, are you optimistic about protecting children in the future, and why? So let's start with Elysse.
Of course, I'm optimistic about protecting children in the future. I think that the more that the communities are becoming aware of the issue and aware of why children are so uniquely vulnerable, I think that with education and with greater awareness, the institutions directly responsible for investigating these crimes, really preventing these crimes, are not just going to be better recognized and more empowered, but also more optimistic themselves. So I think that keeping that positive momentum going forward is going to be on all of us to keep the issue at the forefront of everyone's minds.
Great. Phil?
Absolutely. You cannot do this work, any of us, without having hope and optimism, and there's plenty of hope for reform. I will say that what we are seeing in our country is a recognition of voice and choice that has not been previously experienced by many that have been marginalized, including children. And so there's a lot to have optimism for in terms of moving forward.
Fantastic. Joyanna?
Yes, absolutely. I'm optimistic too. Super duper optimistic. Children are getting smarter and smarter and smarter. I mean, I have to ask questions from 3-year-olds to find out how to work technical equipment sometimes. So that applies to all aspects of life. Children are getting smarter. We are getting smarter in knowing how to protect them. The Me Too movement is filtering down to children. The information available in the information age is overwhelming. And we're going to learn how to harness all of the transparency that maybe some of us don't like with the intrusions into our private space of the internet world. We're going to learn how to harness that to make it impossible to have secrets that adults are keeping with children that are bad. So that's going to change.
That would be a massively good change. James, you have 30 seconds.
Boy, I'm not optimistic. I'm going to give the contrarian view here. I know everyone's going to blame me, but well, it's going to spur donations because our work never ends. I'm cautiously optimistic. How about that? I'm not very optimistic, and here's why. And I think this is part of the message that we are trying to deliver. There's an old saying that holds truer to this field than any other field, which is Willie Horton, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is, right? So and this is the primary motivator of pedophiles, right? And child molesters. Why do you work with children? Because that's, why do you work for a daycare? Why are you a coach? Why are you a teacher? Why are you a cop? Why are you a pediatric endocrinologist, right? Well, that's where the kids are. So, I've been in this field for 30 years. The more I know, the more cynical I become, just because we need a change in the mindset of the Willie Horton mindset, which is if you're in the bank and got a gun, you're probably there because of the money. And same with kids. And I said in the chat, somebody said, well, we do background checks. Well, 99% of the people that are convicted have a clean background. You can't do a background check and think you've done your job. Boy Scouts, many years. Now they've got 2 adults with a kid. Kid can't be alone with an adult, one-on-one, 2 adults. So it's going to create a lot of change. And I agree with Joy that educating children and getting beyond the secrets, and I think that is primarily the only hope that we have, is to destigmatize this kind of harm and this kind of abuse so that children will be empowered to report instances in which they feel uncomfortable. Of course, that then requires a willing adult and a smart adult to listen and do something about it. So I'd like to say we're going to work our way out of business. We're going to close down Child USA once the GLOBE standard gets passed and everyone's following it. But I unfortunately think that we're going to be at work for a long, long time. There's hope in that. There's change. But one of the biggest things that I've always protested to Marci is like, we're going to end child abuse. If we think we're going to end child abuse, we're deluding ourselves. It's got to be a constant process of reinvention, rediscovery, and reform. And that's what we're about at Child USA. And that's what this commission was about. This is only a start. Any one of these proposals could take a lifetime to implement. So we really need an army of you out there listening to this to help make this vision a reality, with the knowledge that you can never do enough to protect the safety and well-being of children, because Willie Horton's going to find a way to get one of those ghost guns, right? The plastic guns, that the metal, right? There's always going to be a motivation to abuse children. And I think if we have that awareness in everything that we do around this issue, children are going to be much safer as a result.
So it won't surprise anybody that I'm extremely optimistic that we can do better. We certainly can do better. Part of our problem has been ignorance, but a lot of our problem has been who we defer to. We defer to the bishops, we defer to the high-powered doctors, we defer to Jerry Sandusky, to Larry Nassar. That's our problem. So what Child USA is working on is the civil rights of children, to treat them as humans and to give them a space at the table where all these policies are being decided. So I hope, to echo James, I hope every single one of you will share this with someone you know and understand that we can do better. And we need everyone at the top and the bottom to make that happen. Thanks so much for joining us, and stay in touch by signing up for our newsletter, childusa.org. Thanks.
Thank you for participating. Thanks to our commissioners too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.